Today we're broadcasting from Berkeley. We're here because it is a pillar of the tech and life sciences startup ecosystem of the greater Silicon Valley. When you think Berkeley, you think innovation and entrepreneurship, and I think startups. Hi there, I'm Louis Lehot, and this is our video blog series called Ask a Silicon Valley Lawyer. I'm here with my friend Nicole Hatcher, and today we're going to talk about board advisors and putting together an advisory board. Nicole, before we start, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, I am Nicole Hatcher. I am the founding partner of Allen & Hatcher.
Nicole, thanks so much for joining. And, we just finished a video blog about board observers, and I wanted to switch to a different topic and ask you to share your advice about how to put together the very best advisory board.
Yeah.
When do you start thinking about that in the life of a company?
Yeah.
And is it something that's useful, and why?
Yeah. So there are typically a couple of different reasons for putting together an advisory board. One is your company is early on. You want advisors to sort of help you out, give you advice, obviously, and sort of really come in and help you steer the direction of the company. Usually this happens when there's only a small founding team, so maybe one founder, and if you have a strong advisory board, you can really make up for the lack of a founding team. The other places that I see an advisory board a lot is when you have a lot of strategic interest in your company, and your advisory board is made up of a lot of strategic investors that you would not otherwise want in your board meetings, your board of directors, because you don't want sort of to give confidential information out to these folks, but they can help you strategically in what your company is doing.
I agree with you. I like to think of an advisory board as something that's very informal.
Right.
Maybe they don't meet together. Maybe it's just an honorific title that you give to somebody who's writing a big check, who can provide some strategic advice, commercial advice, maybe somebody who can introduce you to key customers, maybe channels of business for your product, and somebody who is really going to be helpful.
Yeah.
I typically don't see them meeting a lot, except in life science companies where you need to put together a medical advisory board where maybe it's a bunch of luminaries that are really for a vaccine epidemiologist or something like that. Tell me, when you're having that first conversation, how do you tee up how do you formalize the engagement? Do you have an agreement? Do you give them equity? Do you compensate them with cash or some other way?
Yeah, great question. So generally you would have an advisor agreement. You should always have an agreement outlining the relationship between the company and the advisor. You also want to make sure that that advisor is subject to confidentiality provisions because they will be privy to some information about your company. So you would have an advisor agreement. As far as equity in early stage companies, you don't see a ton of equity. There could be a small option grant that may vest sort of monthly. It's not your typical Silicon Valley standard for your vesting with a cliff. That's not typically given to advisors. It's on a monthly basis or an outright stock grant. But it would be fairly small for advisors. And don't really see cash compensation early on for advisors. When you're looking more towards later stage companies, you may think about compensation, but it's not typical or market.
I agree. I typically see in early stage companies advisors asking for somewhere between a quarter and a full point of equity out of the pool. Since it's early, that's going to get diluted quite a bit. So I kind of think of it like monopoly money at the outset. And what I tell advisors when I have this conversation with them to lock them in is, hey, if you ask for a full point, we're really going to need you to be engaged. And you're going to need to be available for weekly calls. We're going to have deliverables. And I think the Founder Institute has done a really good job of setting this out with a grid of how much equity you get for how much contribution of time. And I think it's really a continuum between a quarter point and a full point. And for companies where it's beyond the initial early stages, I wouldn't talk about a percentage of equity. To your point, it would just be a block, and I'd say 10,000 options or 25,000 options, and then I would talk about the 409A valuation versus the last equity valuation of preferred stock, and imply that there's a lot of upside in between those two numbers for the advisor to capture. I guess the other thing I agree with you is that you wouldn't see a cliff. I typically see 2-year vesting monthly with a single trigger change of control, because obviously if the company gets sold, the buyer doesn't need them, and their engagement is over at that point. And then the question then becomes, after that 2 years, what do you do? And you're probably that engagement's over, or you're going to have to do another block of a similar size.
Exactly.
Last question for you, Nicole, before we break. Do you ever have like an advisory board charter or any other kind of formal document?
Absolutely. Sometimes, so as you mentioned before, usually advisors are pretty informal. They don't all meet together. But if you do have a true advisory board where they are providing strategic advice on a particular subject, you would form them together and actually have meetings of the advisory board, in which case you would want an advisory board charter. And the charter just lays out things like, how often does the advisory board meet? What do they present? And then the advisory board may present their findings or their recommendations to the full board of directors.
Really helpful advice on board advisors. Thank you, Nicole, for joining.
Thank you.
If you have any questions about board advisors, don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. Nicole?
Yes, you can reach me at nicole@allenhatcher.com.
And I'm at louis.lehot@l2counsel.com, or just find me on l2counsel.com. Thanks so much for joining.